A Glance in the Mirror. Chapter 42. Special Day. Christmas 1982, Terry helped collect the girls from school, sorting out their trunks, and with this time the boys came home too. Terry fitted in as best he could with all the arrangements, including the children visiting their father. This was to be his new routine. It seemed perfectly settled and enjoyable, making his past life back at Leighton Cottage lonely, uninteresting and very quiet. Terry knew now what he had been missing. Terry saw Rebecca on a monthly basis at Rita's house. This 70-mile round trip had to be undergone to coincide with her leaving school. He would wait outside the gates to see her coming out with her friends. They would all pile into his car to be dropped off on the way. They ended up at Rita's house to spend over an hour together before taking her home. It was the only arrangement possible, although very unsatisfactory. These visits ended when Rita said that she couldn't bear them any longer, because she couldn't stand the noise and disruption. Unfortunately, Terry never received an invitation to view Rebecca's work while she was at North London, or to attend any of the school open days, meet the teacher events or sports days. Her mother naturally tended to be first with the invitations and coming events diary, which was understandable but annoying. Terry saw Benjamin a few times coming out of the amusement arcade in Maynard's Lane, but that was all, for he never came to Leighton Cottage, no doubt preferring the cinema or arcade. It was enormously difficult to see any of them at all. Meeting on street corners or in the park was just not realistic. Whilst he had been at Pinner, only Rebecca had been a regular visitor on a weekly basis. For much of the time, the only visitor. The object of buying the house, in walking distance of Norwood Drive, was wasted. It was also not really a satisfactory situation, because Terry knew every street corner, every twist and turn of every road, and each area had a memory, and of course there was always the chance of bumping into Sally or her friend. Fortunately, that was now in the past. Terry had now had a future with Josephine. Rebecca got on well with her, and could always stay at Late Tinker's Hay if she ever felt the need. It was a happy period. By the end of the year, there were nearly 3.5 million unemployed, and the future wasn't so predictable nor settled. It was believed that computers would completely take over all aspects of life. Planning, hand skills and labour-intensive manufacturing, leaving just the service industry. And like all predictions, this didn't come about quickly, but took about another 20 years. The printing industry, led by the newspapers, was deteriorating in both profitability and print quality. Firms were folding up almost weekly. Information technology, in the shape of computerized print production, including colour reproduction, was being produced using all new electronic equipment. The hold previously maintained by the strong unions were now undermined by the changing technology, coupled with increasingly high unemployment. Firms abroad won orders for printing contracts. Production methods and labour produced cheaper, faster print runs at a higher standard, and this created a disorientated, disillusioned workforce which lost its union strength. Workers became adaptable, which is exactly what the managements wanted in the first place. The print union memberships had held the employers to ransom, and even when it was obvious that Webb Opposite Litho was the future, the newspaper still continued to be produced using hot metal typesetting using linotype. Eddie Shah led the way in Warrington using non-union labour. Journalists typed their own copy, reducing the need for print halls, and by 1988 almost all national newspapers had moved out of Fleet Street to relocate in the Docklands, operating them using the same labour as Murdoch's News International. Within further education colleges, and in particular the pre-printing processes at London College of Printing, there was great disquiet. Gravure suffered most, for there was very little of the department left. Letterpress relied upon flexography to support its staff. Lithography, although on the rise as a process, gave way to rotary scanners for its reproduction technology, and screen process continued to expand, having more packaging and front-of-store advertising. There was talk about new forms of image production, including inkjet and toners, all part of the new reproduction technology. Further education, the industrial training boards, took up training for industry. The government acknowledged it by instigating a new concept called industrial training boards. Industry recognized that vocational training was at an all-time low in terms of both quality and worthwhileness. The industrial training boards were set up to try and make sure reasonable standards of all up-to-date information and relevant skills were both being taught in the workplace and further education colleges. All these things had to be able to be tested, assessed, and marks given, and every trainee or apprentice had to have their standards entered into a training manual, signed by the student's firm, and college, and finally the board inspector checked these reports. On a bright sunny morning, that 10th of May, 1983, Josephine and Terry got married at Aylesbury Registry Office. Terry had Duncan Kirby as his best man, and Josephine had his wife Julia as consort. They were very happy to be there, and to share what was to be a very joyful union. Before getting married, they had discussed with their solicitor the consequences of altering their name, so that both sets of children wouldn't feel excluded. And thereafter they used the name Mitman Keary. Josephine's boys never used this facility, but the girls did for the rest of their school and college life. The agreement to get married, to hold the ceremony unknown to everyone else, was personal. It was exciting, intimate, and wholly in keeping with how they felt at the time. They never thought this to be selfish or unthoughtful, but wanting, perhaps even needing, something to call their own after losing such a great deal. When they got back to their home after the ceremony, Terry carried Josephine over the threshold, and they all celebrated together with their friends, cutting the cake and toasting the occasion with champagne. Their marriage prompted them to give much thought to how the girls were to be educated, whether Sharman-Dean was fitting or not. The girls wanted to become day girls and live at home, and to do that they would have to move nearer to the school. Anthony was finishing his A-levels and Christopher had another year to go. Josephine and Terry drove out to Manchester to witness Simon's graduation. It was something of a challenge to get him kitted out in his mortarboard and gown for the official photograph. Eventually, Simon trailed them back south in his trusty Mini. The paper industry was suffering from competition from Scandinavia and Canada, which was undermining the UK's production. Simon would have to seek work abroad to get the most out of his qualifications. Because of this and other reasons relating to future prospects, Simon changed direction and became an accountant after graduating. His first job was with Knox Cropper, accountants based at Blackfriars in London. Terry often met up with him at Blackfriars when walking between the Elephant and Castle to Backhill, Farringdon, where the college had an annex. After their wedding in May, home life for them was at Tinker's Hay. Leighton Cottages was still in the hands of the builders, although almost finished. Terry went back there at frequent intervals to see how they were getting on. When the extension had been built, he placed the property on the market, and thankfully it was soon sold, covering all his expenses with a few £1,000s to spare. All the furniture, so lovingly and carefully gathered together, was sold or given back to charity. The 2 clocks used as part exchange for a lovely Vienna regulator clock, and the surplus goods given to Florence and Iris. Leighton College had been a fine bolt-hole from a not very nice world. Still, there was excitement in the air and a new beginning to contemplate. And that Easter, as a family, they moved to East Anglia to spend a week at the Trust House Forte. But was their initiation into the region. Little did they realise that they would return to that part of the country many years later. All the children came home at the end of the summer term. Anthony had finished at school and took up part-time work as an organist at the local church, whilst cutting out a career as a rock group musician playing keyboard and composing. The girls were to go back to school as weekly boarders. Helen, who had a serious allergy, was finding it very difficult to control her symptoms, even though she was religiously maintaining the course of treatment given by her doctors. Whatever was done to alleviate the problem, the eczema persisted. I don't believe, at the time with the knowledge known we missed out any prescribed medical course of treatment or environmental change to defeat the problem. Age would have to be the final cure. And that year they flew to Venice to take part in a conference at the Danieli Hotel, where they sampled all the delights of that magical city, plus a gondola ride and masked ball. On their return, they took a trip along the Orient Express line back to Paris, dressed in outfits representing the 1920s. Josephine and Terry were asked to join a team in Hertfordshire to discuss and formulate a plan for the country if there were to be a nuclear attack. And this was to last for a number of weeks, and during that time they were introduced to all the county's special fallout shelters and emergency equipment. The lectures were frightening and very informative, although quite obviously it was a problem. It showed how an expected attack was considered possible and prepared the country the country was to such an eventuality. That summer they drove Flo and Iris, plus Rebecca and the girls, to Warner's holiday camp on the Isle of Wight. Arriving late in a thunderstorm which scared the girls, made getting into bed for them even more welcoming, as they hid under the covers in fun. Having such a diverse group all mucking in together, using every camp facility to get the most out of what there was on offer, this heightened the experience. It became a challenge to see how many things could be done in a day, and everyone enjoyed the dances in the evening, and to see Flo and Iris doing the conga was an event not to be missed. On their arrival back, they gave thought to the girls' request to become day girls. They quickly came to the conclusion that for the time being at least the girls would have to stay at their school in Buckingham. If their wish was to come true, the family would have to move nearer to the school. They consulted estate agents, both to look for a property and to place theirs on the market. And whilst this was in progress, Josephine continued her work, which took her on a regular round trip to London. Whilst all this was going on, they organised a visit out to Altea for the girls and Chris. They were all to pile into Terry's car and motor all the way. It was a challenge to drive that far. Then find nightly lodgings, taking pot luck as to its ratings. And as it turned out, though, it was a thoroughly enjoyable experience, and they all got to see something of Spain, as well as the house in Bernier Gulf. The girls sampled donkey riding and the delights of the pool, strolling around Altea, whilst taking in the local atmosphere by taking the lemon train up the coast. This was the time of Conservative rule under Margaret Thatcher. It was about free markets, reducing public spending, privatisation, monetary control. A Union Jack-waving society that applauded self-help, each individual looking after their own interests regarding education, pension, health and long-term care. It brought about trade union reform, outlawing secondary picketing, and made inroads into the eventual banning of closed shops. The Conservatives made unions legally liable for infringements to negotiated settlements, promoted regular election of union leaders, and made it public knowledge how much union funds were being donated to political bodies. As unemployment soared, union membership dropped. Both these events made the government's position stronger. And halfway through Thatcher's reign, the miners' strike took place, which lasted a year. She had been very secretive about the amount of planning which had gone ahead of the strike to hoard large stocks of coal at all the generating stations. About the same time, the print unions were stripped of their power by the move of the presses from Fleet Street to Wapping, having to change their working practices. Robert Maxwell created a massive print and communication business, taking over and stripping out redundant workers. Unemployment was at its peak a year later, with 3.4 million workers out of work. At the end of this period, the public held the Conservative government responsible for the inflation that was rife. That summer, Chris and Terry painted the outside of Tinker's Hay, whilst the girls cycled round and round, making Chris furious because they were getting in the way. They had their tea breaks, sharing a convivial smoke in the garden shed. It was thus a very happy period, and a great deal was done to the garden to make it all the more attractive. One way Terry thought might improve the vista was to cut and shape a gateway-shaped hole in the high hedge which surrounded the garden, and this gave the impression that the garden continued into the next field and beyond. Down the valley towards Aston Clinton, all the trees in the orchard were pruned into shape and the lawn sculptured, allowing different heights of grass to grow. By the time he had finished the garden, a walkway followed the outline of the trimmed lawn, leading round the garden to give interest and variation.